This is Blackjacked, a podcast about how the civil rights movement went left.
Oh man, I gotta get up. I gotta go. I gotta go. I gotta go. I gotta go. I gotta get up and go. I gotta go. I gotta go. I gotta get up and go. I gotta get up and leave. I gotta get up and go.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to a very special edition of Blackjack. This is not the normal episode. We're going to kind of do a little something different today that I felt was necessary. Here's my question. Can we blame white people for slavery during the time of slavery? In other words, if everybody was down with slavery, is it fair in 2024 to point to white people, let's say in 1840, and say you're a bad person because you went along with slavery? That's a legitimate question, right? I think most black people would say, well, absolutely. Yes, we can blame you. That was wrong. I don't care what year it was wrong. But part of the reason we do that, and I think a very convincing reason, is we don't have to stand in 2024 to condemn you. There were people who existed back then who condemned it. White people. And let me just say, this is a complete aside. One of the things I really get annoyed with when people do this thing where they sort of downplay slavery. Yes, slavery has always sort of existed throughout the world in you know, all kind of places. What happened here wasn't normal in world history. You had slaves in other societies who were prominent, who led armies, who did. No, slaves here were not even people. We quite literally degraded people into non-human. What we did to people and their families, like, no, this was not normal. It wasn't normal just to be breaking up families and to be like, no, like, yeah. Can we stop this whole thing? Like, we let people give these talking points to pretend like, I mean, like we're just acting like special victims and we're just being crazy because, I mean, there's always been slavery. You're not special. You're not unique. Yes, this was unique. Study slavery in the Roman society. So even in African countries, like study what they call slavery and what y'all did here. It's not the same. And I'm sorry. We need to start challenging people on those talking points. Did bad things happen to slaves in other places? Yes, but not this. The level of brutality and inhumanity, like, is no. Stop it. You have a William Lloyd Garrison, a famous abolitionist. We talked about in episode 4 about white allies. You have a man by the name of John Brown who was so committed to the cause of destroying slavery that he put his own life on the line, him and his sons. So we can point to John Brown and say, because of the presence of those people at that time, we can condemn you for slavery. The problem with that logic, though, for black people today is when you do a podcast, when you sort of look at the civil rights movement and you analyze that and sometimes critique that, they just ain't with it. But if we're going to look at white people and say that you have peers, people in your time, in that era who knew that you were off then, you can't have it both ways. Because what I try to do a lot with this podcast is I try to look at the history objectively and say, okay, here's what happened. Here are the implications of what happened. But I really try to look at who were the contemporaries. So again, if I say the NAACP should have had a greater focus on economics, I'm saying W.E.B. Du Bois was sitting right there in the office and he's saying that. If I look at the Montgomery bus boycott and say, there was a pretty big missed opportunity here. Well, it's not just me saying that in 2024. We have to look at someone like S.B. Fuller, which I do in episode 7, who was much older than Dr. King, by the way, in that era, who says, hey, this is right. So that's the first thing. We can't have it both ways. You can't say we can condemn white people in the past because their peers condemn them, but not apply the same thing to black people. Now, the next part is this. We have to be careful with the words. I don't think we can ever be judgmental of anyone in the past. Well, some people, but you know what I mean? Like we have to be careful. And part of that specific to the civil rights movement, and again, this is something I try very hard to do in every episode. We can't condemn these people. We can't, look down on them. we have to be mindful of their context. And I think I try to do that consistently to say, look, here's what happened, but here's why they probably did that. So, for example, with the Montgomery bus boycott, yeah, they didn't take the more radical approach of what S.B. Fuller suggested, which is buying the bus line, but there's probably good reasons. Here are people who, just for asking to ride in front of the bus, I point to the example of the lady in the episode. She was arrested, her daughter was raped and retaliated. Like, there's some extreme terrorism that they're encountering and facing every day that we just can't appreciate in 2024. We're not living the same, like we're not living under the same circumstances. And so I try to do a very good job of pointing that. I try to be consistent and I try to be fair. The reality is, if we were in that time period, we very likely would have done the same and probably a lot less than they did. So remember, the people who participate in these movements, whether boycotts, marches, whatever it might be, these are the minority of black people. Most black people are at the house, right? They're at the house eating Cheetos. They're at work. They're telling their children, don't go out there and get involved in this stuff. Don't do that. Don't risk your life. Don't risk your future. And you would do the same thing. You would not want your children out in the streets being beaten by policemen, being bitten by police dogs or like lynched. Like, you wouldn't want that. Not for your kids. You let somebody else's kid do it. And so these are human beings trying to cope with their reality and trying to navigate through the world that they live in. We can't demonize them for this. What I'm trying to do with this podcast, though, is just look at what are the implications of that? What are the results? They did this, and then this happened, and it created the world that we have. So if we see a lack of progress, if we see the basic fundamentals have not shifted as far as the dynamic between white and black people, we still live under white domination. Well, here's why. We need to look at what happened and what results did we get. The hope is we look at that and say, what do we need to do moving forward? Because if we keep doing the same thing, you get the same thing. So episode 8, we talked about the movement in Savannah. Hosea Williams and others organized this boycott of the downtown businesses. Those businesses lose $1 million in 1 month. But what happened to the $1 million, right? Was it pooled for economic development? Did they, boycott until they bankrupted these businesses and then maybe they buy them out? And no, the same business owners after the boycott, they still own the businesses. They still control the means of production. They're still in power, and that's the weakness of it. But again, we explain why in that episode. I talked about the account from the book of The Warmth of Other Suns. In 1948, this tenant farmer pays his water bill. He asks for a receipt, and he gets beat down for asking for a receipt, right? This is the world that they live in. So every small act of resistance that they participate in, it's at great peril. It's with great risk. We would be foolish to sit in 2024 and judge them for that. But the point that I did make in the podcast was we're not living in the same era. We will not be lynched for boycotting. So what is our excuse for not having a more sophisticated method of protest? We're still largely using the same methods, and that is a weakness. So what I'm trying to do is look at the past and examine what happened to sort of explain why we have the present consequences. It's not about beating anybody up. What I'm saying is a lot of us have great parents and we love our parents, but we realize our parents didn't do everything perfectly and we want something better for the next generation. So they're not bad parents. They were great. They did what they could. But we talk about all the time parenting out of trauma that, like, everyone's talking about trauma. Well, what we're saying is we realize certain things were not great about our experience and we want to identify and root those out. We'll keep the good and throw away the bad. You can't have that conversation about your biological parents and not have that conversation about our shared communal elders. They did a lot of good and they did the best they could under the circumstances, most likely. But there were times when it was short-sighted. Maybe they didn't see the bigger picture, or maybe, again, because they were living under such terrorism, they couldn't imagine doing anything beyond what they did. Maybe they did what they were comfortable doing, given the fact that they did not want to be lynched. Whatever it might be, we understand we don't want the exact same thing that our parents got. We don't want the same marriage that our parents had. We don't want the same financial habits our parents, like, we understand this in every other realm, but for some reason, when it comes to the Black civil rights struggle, sometimes we get a little defensive. We're open to hearing, hey, our parents were good people, but the way my mom treated my dad, yeah, I don't want that. Okay. Or we're fine with, hey, our parents did the best they could. They just, they didn't have the education I have, and so I can do something better. Nothing wrong with that. And there's nothing wrong with saying, hey, Dr. King, great guy, but hey, he may be short-sighted, or maybe he didn't understand this, or hey, they did the best that they could, but here's the result. It's not the best result. Let's improve upon that. There's nothing wrong with that. But again, we have to be fair. We have to evaluate them within their context. We can't just point fingers from 2024. So again, I try to use contemporaries. I try to use people in their era to look at that. But even with that, you have to be careful because again, you look at the Montgomery bus boycott, S.B. Fuller says, hey, you should do this. Well, remember at that time, S.B. Fuller is in Chicago. He's not in Montgomery, right? Or you have the Nation of Islam in episode 6. I talk about their economic plan and how dynamic this was and other people should be doing this. Elijah Muhammad can talk a lot of stuff from Chicago. He's in Chicago. And no, Chicago wasn't a fantasy for black people, but you don't have a lynching every week in Chicago either. Like, right? They have black enclaves, and certainly within the Nation of Islam, he's not concerned about someone dragging him out of his house in the middle of the night. He's just not. He has guards. He has the Fruit of Islam. Like, he's okay. He can say a lot of things, and he can do a lot of things that Booker T. Washington probably couldn't have done in his day in Tuskegee, Alabama. It's not the so. Even in that moment, we have to be objective and we have to be fair to people. Again, there's probably a good reason why people do what they do, and we would probably do the same thing or less. We just have to be okay being objective about it. We have to be okay with saying, okay, here are the shortcomings of that strategy. Not because they were bad people, not because we're so much smarter, but there were shortcomings. There were flaws sometimes. There were missed opportunities. And it's not because they were bad people. And again, maybe it wasn't a flaw. Maybe it honestly was the best they could do. And that's fine too. But at least acknowledge here were the results. And here's why we're still having these struggles, because the results are these. There's nothing wrong with that. We honor these people. We are here today because of them. We are here today because of a lot of the sacrifices, blood, sweat, tears, and prayers of these people. We absolutely should honor them, just like we honor our parents. But we don't want everything that our parents gave us. We don't want their trauma. We don't want some of their short-sighted parenting. We don't want some of their scars. Some of our parents, again, they did the best they could, but they were parenting from a deficit. Well, we can maybe parent from abundance. Some of them were parenting out of fear. Maybe we can have a different foundation. And so it is here. All we're doing is we're looking at the civil rights movement and saying, here are the results. Some of it wasn't ideal as far as the result, but here's why they did it. And if I can look at the past objectively, that's all we can ask for. But we have to be consistent. If we can look at white people in the past and say, this was probably not ideal because your contemporaries are saying so, we can do the same thing with black people. But again, we have to be fair. We have to always point out the context. And even with those people who are critiquing them in that moment, we have to be fair to them too. If this is some black person living comfortably close to Canada, yeah, they can talk a lot of noise, but they don't have to get up in Alabama every day. We have to. So I try to do a good job at that. And maybe I don't do the best job at it, but I'm trying to be fair and I'm trying to be objective. So is it fair to criticize civil rights leaders? In the final analysis, I don't think it's fair to criticize someone who's really trying. I think it's perfectly okay to objectively analyze the history and look at the results and try to be fair to them and explain why they did what they did and look at what the work that's left to do, understanding what the past netted and what we want for the future. So last week, after episode 8, you may or may not have caught it, but I was sort of non-committal about the topic for this week. That's because I kind of sort of felt like I needed to do this and address this. I've had conversations with people, and some people really just don't like this. They don't like what I'm doing. They don't think I'm being fair to the elders. And I want to apologize if you ever felt that way. And yes, I probably do need to do a better job at, highlighting the context, the mitigating factors, and the reasons why people do what they did and their limitations. And yes, let's be clear, we would have done the same, and very likely we would have done a lot less. So we need to honor them for that. But that doesn't mean we have to worship and not be objective. So next week, we'll get back to an actual regular episode of the Blackjack Podcast. We're going to keep talking about how the civil rights movement went left, and I hope you're here with me.
I gotta go. I gotta get up and go. I gotta get up and leave. I gotta get I gotta get up and go. They waiting on me when I walk out the door. They counting on me to get ready to blow. Too many people saying that I'm the hero. Too many people looking up to me. Can't let them down, not an option for me. Don't even matter if you rockin' with me. I touch down even if you ain't blocking for me. No BS and no negativity. Only dealing with positive energy. Yeah, it's haters and doubters surrounding me. I don't pay them no man, they ain't stopping me. Like Brady and Jordan on top of me. I'm MVP in every category. My confidence grows every day that I rise. Gotta get up and go, keep my eye on the prize. I gotta go, manifesting on my hopes and dreams. I gotta go, yo, I'm strategizing like I'm coaching the team. I got places to go, I got people to see, I got things to do. Yo, I'm through with surviving, it's time to start living, I don't know about you. That's what I see for myself, speak over my life, I got riches and wealth. Take it in stride one day at a time, no malice inside, I'm nothing but blessed.